Isaac Steincamp from the Chess Summit Network, and I'm back from the National Chess Congress. This past weekend in Philadelphia, I scored 3.5 out of 6 in the U2200 section, which brought my rating back over 2,000, and I picked up a canon norm in the process. So, relatively good weekend for me, and for today's video, I wanted to show my second round game in which I beat a 2100 with the black pieces. Why do I want to show this game? Well, I think it was a model game of how to play in a race position. So what exactly is a race position? The race position is I'm going to play on one side of the board and you're going to play on the other side of the board, and it's a matter of who can get their attack working first. So for example, in the Yugoslav, white traditionally castles queenside, whereas black castles kingside, and white marches the H and G pawns while black looks for counterplay on the queenside. Another famous example would be in the King's Indian, where black castles on the king side but pushes his E and F pawns, tries to close the position, and plays on the king side, where white tries to create space and expand on the queen side. Both of these are good examples of a race position, and another good example would be a closed Sicilian, which is what happens in this game. So my opponent opens with E4, and for the closed Sicilian, here I'm just playing the traditional main line, nothing too fancy here. D3, D6, F4, Knight of 6, Knight of 3, and I think here is the first critical position in the closed Sicilian, where maybe what I play or what somebody else plays is going to be different from Sicilian player to Sicilian player. So I think for most players would choose to castle here, and there's nothing wrong with this move. This move is perfectly natural. But as you look into the position, you know, one of the ideas of the opening is you're going to develop all of your pieces, and you know, I haven't quite done that yet. My C8 bishop, you know, still has to find a place to go. My opponent is just going to put his bishop on E3, like a traditional closed Sicilian. So there's nothing too complicated here for white. But as I look around the board, where am I going to put my light squared bishop? You know, D7 is a mighty inactive square. E6 doesn't really promise anything. And G4 is a good square, but here in this position, my opponent can get tricky and perhaps play H3, limiting what I can do with this bishop. My opponent's in no rush to necessarily castle immediately or finish development immediately if it means slowing down my ability to play in this position. So because of this, in this position, I played bishop to G4, pinning this critical knight to the queen, but also letting me have full control over the D4 square. My opponent played H3, attacking the bishop, and seeing as my bishop now no longer has any really good squares to go, I figured it might as well be beneficial to me to trade the bishop for the knight. That way, white doesn't have nearly as much control over the G5 and E5 squares, and now a kingside attack will be a little bit more difficult for my opponent. My opponent played queen takes, and so here I need to recognize why I played bishop to G4. I played bishop to G4 to pin the knight to the queen and control the D4 square. Now that the white knight from F3 has been eliminated from the game, my opponent has no protectors of the D4 square, giving me a perfect forcing move, knight to D4. My opponent plays queen F2, protecting the C2 fork, so now knight takes C2s would be met by queen takes C2. And so here, in this position, again, I have two choices. I could castle, or I could look for other moves to improve my position. At this point in the game, I don't really, I don't really see a need to castle yet. My opponent hasn't really developed his attack, but at the same time, he hasn't committed his king either. I would be much more comfortable castling kingside, for instance, if my opponent had also castled kingside, because by doing that, moving pawns in front of his king gives me more things and more options to do around his king by opening up the position. Whereas if he castles queenside, now I'd have to take a kingside pawn storm a little bit more seriously. So here I made a waiting move that I think is good for me, rook to b8. Why rook to b8? Well, rook to b8, I want to push this b pawn and somehow get up to b4. With the idea being I'm going to kick this knight and somehow create a pawn imbalance over here on the queen side. What is a pawn imbalance? Well, I'll show you specifically later in the game, but a pawn imbalance makes the position a little bit more double-edged, gives my opponent's weaknesses while it potentially opens some half-open files for me to play on, as what happens in the game. Now, here my opponent castled. So because he castled, out of principle, I decided I should castle. Not necessarily to say that if your opponent castles, you should always castle, but because he's castled on the king side, moving the pawns in front of his king will create weaknesses. So I'm now less concerned about my opponent's ability to attack on the king side. But I think it was important that I waited before I moved my king because my opponent committed his king to the king side, it's going to take him a few more moves, whereas if I just castled immediately, he might have been able to push g4, wasting less time. That being said, my opponent played g4 anyways. So in this position, it was kind of critical. I needed to calculate my opponent's possibility of playing the move f4 to f5. In this case, I wasn't too concerned, because after f4, f5, while if I play g takes f5, it opens up my king, I can actually sit and do nothing, because f takes g6 just puts the queen on an open file, which is a little bit edgy for my opponent, and by having the pawn on f5, my opponent doesn't really accomplish anything. So that being said, I understood that this was a race position, so I have to race my opponent. So I just played the simple move b7 to b5. I played rook b8 to play this move, so I might as well play it. It's also critical to notice that the rook belongs on b8 because now there's no threat of e4, e5 with the discovery from the bishop. So back here, while you could argue that this b pawn would be protected from b5 by the knight, I do open myself up to a nasty discovery, e4 to e5, attacking both the knight and the bishop. So that's why I had to play rook b8 first, and then b5. Okay, my opponent played a3 here, stopping my idea of b4. If I played b4 now, I could lose a piece, because after takes, queen takes, and rook takes would lose a pawn. Rook takes a7. So neither one of these options is really appealing to me. So in this position, I just made the threat of b4 a little bit more concrete. I played a7 to a5. So here my opponent continued to improve his position. He played knight to d1 with the threat of c3. Now, here I had to take a minute and think. c3 is a traditional idea in the closed Sicilian, but I wasn't quite sure if I should be concerned about it immediately. And the reason why is, let's make a nothing move for me. I don't know, rook to e8. And let's just assume my opponent plays c3. My opponent has no light square control on the queen side, so now moving my knight to b3 is actually a very interesting and appealing option. Not only do I get a forcing move on this rook, I now have the option to trade my knight for his dark squared bishop, meaning that it will be very difficult for him to attack on my king side with my dark squared bishop nicely tucked in on the king side. So that being said, I wasn't too worried about c3. c3, while a typical idea, doesn't really hurt the position for me. So here I decided to make a waiting move, but also helped me positionally. So I played a4, and my opponent did not expect this. But the idea is that if my opponent chooses to play c3, I have a permanent outpost here on b3. My opponent has no easy way of being able to eliminate my knight from b3. It might even be advantageous for me not to trade the knight for the bishop at this point in time. Also, the other thing I had to consider was I was looking at pushing b4. That's why I played a7, a5. But the one thing I didn't like about this move is while this move does stop c3, my opponent might have this move, a4, locking up the position. The pawns are balanced, so now white can just lock up the position. If I'm not careful, he's going to follow up with b2 to b3 after moving this rook off this diagonal, and I may no longer have an attack, and that's not good in a race position. So by playing a5 to a4, I'm planning to create a pawn imbalance, and by doing that, at some point I want to play b4, and then trade on b4, the a pawn for the c pawn, so that way I have a half open c file. So let's see how this works out. I played a4. Whoops. My opponent played knight to e3. I thought that this was the best move, and it makes things interesting for me because now if I push b4 immediately, I do give up the c4 square. So that being said, I didn't want to give my opponent any form of counterplay. In fact, I think after b4, knight c4, my opponent is probably reasonably happy with this position. The threat of having a rook on the c file isn't really too intimidating, so I'm not really doing what I want to do. So in these kinds of positions where you can't really force anything to happen, it's just best to improve your position. So I look to see what I can do to set up defenses for the king side while also improving my position overall. And this is why I played queen to d7. The idea is, if my opponent plays h4, this pawn on g4 is hanging to knight takes g4, knight takes g4, queen takes g4, and now I have a nasty attack on the king side. I can maybe play knight to e2 check, or I can just sit and make my opponent feel seriously uncomfortable. So he can't push the h-pawn too easily. Again, moving f5 doesn't really help my opponent too much, But furthermore, if my opponent tries to ever play g5, I have knight to h5, and now my opponent will have a hard time getting in this move bishop f3 without giving me this h3 pawn. So queen d7 helps my defenses on the king's side in terms of stopping white from moving his pawns forward, but the more important thing that it does is it connects my rooks. Now that my rooks are connected, I can bring my f8 rook into the game at some point, maybe onto the c-file, and put more pressure on white's position. So I was extremely happy with how this turned out. So here my opponent played bishop to d2. And this is a natural developing move, and it connects the rooks. So, good move by my opponent, but I played b4 here. Now, I did have to calculate a lot on this move, but the idea is that I'm going to open up this dark square diagonal for my bishop. And it's easiest for me to do that in this position by creating a pawn imbalance. So my opponent took, and now this bishop is on a nice open diagonal, and I could put a rook on a nice half open diagonal. Now, in order to play this move, I had to calculate some tactics, and the tactic was what to do if bishop takes b4. Well, I'd set up rook takes b4. My opponent plays c3, getting the material back. I play knight to b3, remember that nice south post. C takes b4. Knight takes a1. Rook takes a1. Now the critical moves here. You'll notice I am down a pawn, but my opponent's structure is very weak. So it's critical that I make the best possible moves. Queen to b5, attacking both d3 and b4. This forces queen to d2. I was considering here rook to b8, forcing knight c2. And now knight d7 is extremely annoying. And now my opponent has to guard this b2 pawn. He can do that with rook a2 or rook b1. So let's assume rook b1, maybe keeping the rook a little bit more flexible. Now my opponent has no real improvements he can make to his position because everything is locked down. So even though I am down a pawn here, I have some advantages. Perhaps I can go for this h5 plan, open up the king's side. Maybe I can look at e5 if my opponent doesn't have f5, or maybe I play f5 myself. But I have options here while my opponent is holding on to this backwards d3 pawn and these doubled pawns on the b file. Honestly, I think it's better for my opponent to just give me this b4 pawn. And at that point, material would be equal and I have more active pieces. So I was prepared for this line, but I had to calculate it in order to make this line work. So okay. So here my opponent panicked a little bit, and that's, you'll see that sometimes in race positions where, the game is really intense, and now any mistake that you make, can cost you the game. And that's, kind of what happened here. My opponent played g5, and here is where I think things started to go downhill. My knight has only two options, h5 and e8. Well, if I play knight to e8, my rook is now blocked off from f8. So I wanted to make sure all of my pieces were strong. And that's why I played knight h5. You'll notice here, again, bishop f3 doesn't work, not only because I can take it, but because there's still queen takes h3 in the position. As a threat. So, I was planning here knight takes f4, and then, a threat on h3, and if my opponent plays h4, obviously knight h3 check. So because of this threat on h3, this attack works, because again, after knight takes f4, maybe my opponent was trying to sack this pawn to create a half-open file. King h2 still doesn't work because of this queen takes h3 idea. So not queen takes h3 immediately, because of this bishop g4, and then, this isn't as advantageous for me, with my knight a little bit awkward. But the idea is that because h3 is under pressure, I can take on f4 first and then snap on h3 later. My opponent has no defenses. So bishop f3 wasn't really a viable option here for my opponent. And so here he started to realize he had some light squared weaknesses. Even though I don't have a light squared bishop, my knights are doing such a great job, the one from d4 in the center and the one from h5 on the outside, that he felt like the square e2 was a critical weakness. So my opponent played, rook on f to e1, covering e2 square. So now here I had a couple decisions. First, I was looking at knight to e6, attacking the f4 pawn, but then I'm encouraged to move f5. So let's take a look at that. Knight e6, f5. I'm not as comfortable in the position as I was 2 moves ago. So I went back and I started looking at the move f5, and this move was appealing, and I almost made this move. But my problem with it was after this move, takes, queen takes. I thought I was better. But Now this light square diagonals open up, and my opponent can try to find some avenues of play. He can try for this bishop e4 idea, maybe even willingly give up the h3 pawn. I'm still a little bit better here, but I want to make sure I'm the best possible in the position. But I noticed in both of those lines, they both, increase the utility of my g7 bishop. So, let's go back really quick to the f5 line. Takes. This diagonal's opened up, and this could be a potential, strong threat for me. So while this line didn't work out for me, it actually helped me find the move that I made in the game, which I really liked. Wait, not this move. Rook f8, rook fc8 first. My opponent played bishop to c1, protecting the pawn. The bishop wasn't doing too much from d2 anyways. And now I played a3, utilizing this diagonal from the g7 bishop. And now my opponent really started to fold. He played rook to a2. But to illustrate my point, this does look like I'm hanging a pawn. But the idea is I'm not going to take on a3. I'm going to play knight to e6 exclam, attacking the f4 pawn and the a1 rook. My opponent plays like rook b1. And now I have knight on e takes f4, with the idea that I'm attacking h3 and I'm attacking a3. And if my opponent's not careful, I'm going to play bishop to c3, and my opponent's position just completely falls apart. But rook a2 isn't any better. My opponent didn't play rook b1, because at rook b1 he runs into a2, which could yield some interesting possibilities for me. Maybe after rook a8, I put pressure on the c2 pawn, I might be able to push b3. But furthermore, I don't even have to push a2 immediately. I can play this knight e6 idea first, perhaps, and then reroute to c5. But the amount of control I have over this c2 pawn and in the possibilities of pushing this a pawn, my opponent always has to be playing defense, not offense. But rook a2 loses immediately. So I'm going to suggest to pause the video and calculate for maybe a couple minutes, whatever you need, and try to see what is the winning blow here for black. Okay, so if you haven't solved it yet, pause the video. But if you remember, the whole idea of my pawn storm was to create some sort of pawn imbalance where I create a backwards pawn. And that backwards pawn right now is white's Achilles heel, the c2 pawn. So here, the first thing I did in this position was just look, how can I attack the c2 pawn? And when it was clear that there wasn't an easy way to attack it without my opponent being able to respond easily, I just looked at taking the pawn. It is a weak pawn. And there is a tactical combination here. Knight takes c2, knight takes c2, rook takes c2, queen takes c2, and b3. All of this is forced, because if my opponent doesn't take here, I'm winning a pawn, and I'm just going to play b3, and if my opponent plays rook a1, I want a rook. So my opponent has to take the knight, and if my opponent doesn't take my rook here, and for instance plays like a move like queen f1, now all of my opponent's pieces are in precisely the wrong squares, and I can start to look to push my queenside pawns again. So he played queen takes c2, b3, and my opponent quickly played the rest. Queen b1, pawn takes rook, queen takes pawn takes pawn, bishop to e3, queen b4, and here my opponent just let me promote and resigned after b1 equals queen. But I thought that this was a very interesting game from the start. Even though we played a traditional line, by making a pawn imbalance, that was the critical point in this game. So here, queen d7 stopping my opponent's defenses and connecting my rooks. Playing b4 now was critical because I opened up a half-open file for the c2 pawn. My opponent couldn't really do too much with the king side, and when he tried, I just busted open the position thanks to my strong dark squared bishop. And that's why this tactic is able to work. And here I was just able to create a passed pawn. Obviously bishop takes fails to rook takes bishop with a strong attack on the king side now. And my opponent's position just fell apart. So this is my game from the second round of the National Chess Congress. I hope you enjoyed it and have a better understanding of how to play in race positions. And until next time, this is Isaac Steincamp from the Chess Summit Network signing off. Goodbye.